Hey everyone, welcome to Gatsby Days, and this is a recipe to power up Gatsby with authentication. So I love Gatsby. I'm sure that's not a surprise, and I'm sure all of you also love Gatsby. That's why we're here after all. And for me, I think there's something about Gatsby and just how easy it is to set up, especially with things like Markdown and MDX. It kind of just scratches this itch for me both as a developer and a writer. So like most people, I learned about Gatsby as a static site generator. I first learned about Gatsby as sort of an alternative to Jekyll. So I thought that you could only use Gatsby for things like blogs or sales pages or other static sites. And then I later found out that Gatsby is really more of a dynamic site framework. So you can build dynamic React sites in addition to just rendering or generating static pages. The Gatsby folks like to say that Gatsby is a blazing fast web and app framework, not just a site generator, a static site generator. So what's interesting about this, though, is that it kind of leads to some interesting quandaries with Gatsby. One of the ones I'm most interested in, because of my job at Auth0, is authentication in Gatsby. So if you think about it, it kind of makes you think, is authentication in Gatsby the same as just a regular React app? I mean, we are just running React at the end of the day, but it seems like there's some other things going on under the covers. And so that's the kind of thing that we're going to think about here. Maybe you've tried to implement auth in Gatsby and run into weird errors. Maybe you've had everything working just fine in Gatsby develop, but then you run Gatsby build and everything breaks. And these are the kinds of things that we think about when it comes to auth in Gatsby. The other thing I love, well, one of the other thing I love is Mac automation, or just automation in general, but specifically on my Mac. I'm not like an expert or anything, but I just love automating where I can. I use apps like Shortcuts and Keyboard Maestro to automate meeting notes or setting up workspaces for coding or recording, and plenty more. I even listen to this podcast here on the left called The Automators, which is actually an entire podcast about Mac automation. So when I heard about Gatsby Recipes, I got really excited because I'm a fan of that idea of if you're going to do something more than 3 times, you should write a script or something to automate it so you don't have to do it again. Automation also helps prevent errors, which is another thing I like about Gatsby Recipes. So in this talk today, what we're going to do is talk about Gatsby authentication. And to do that, the first thing we're going to talk about is sort of this conceptual framework that you have to understand about build time versus runtime in Gatsby. The next thing we're going to do is talk about hooks, using hooks and context for authentication. And it's mostly going to be just for React, but we're going to see how there's some extra things we need to do for Gatsby. And then lastly, we're going to look at an auth recipe for Gatsby. So I'm going to show you how you can write your own recipe for adding authentication to Gatsby. So I'm Sam Julien. I'm at Sam Julien pretty much everywhere, like Twitter and Twitch. I'm a developer advocate engineer at Auth0. We're an auth platform built for and by developers. I love teaching. That's like my first and foremost thing. I'm a Google developer expert. I'm also an instructor for Thinkster and Egghead. In fact, I actually have a really practical course on Gatsby on Thinkster called Up and Running with Gatsby, so be sure to check that out at thinkster.io. I also do a lot of writing. I love to write at samjulien.com. You can hop on my email list to get helpful articles about life and coding and things like that sent to you. So let's first talk about build time versus runtime in Gatsby. So Gatsby makes this distinction between build time and runtime. And in the build time side of things, we're talking about this process of using a server to compile the site into files that can then be delivered to a web browser later. Now, what's important to understand here is that in the build time, no browser APIs are available. So this is important. This is going to come back later. So things like window or document are not going to be available at the build time. Runtime, on the other hand, this is the process that happens in the browser when you click through and interact with it. So you got JavaScript code that can interact with the browser and use all of those APIs, like window.location, or maybe an AJAX call to submit a form, or injecting things into the DOM, things like that. Gatsby actually creates its own JavaScript runtime that takes over in the browser once the initial HTML has loaded. So again, that's where you'd be able to use things like window and other browser APIs. We're going to focus on the runtime side of things first, because the runtime is where most of authentication happens. So most of the auth that you'll need to do in Gatsby happens during this runtime in the browser. So this is very similar to what you do in vanilla React, but it has a couple of extra nuances and steps. But before we get there, let's do a quick overview of what the basic login flow we'll use in our app looks like. So to do this, we're going to first kick off the login process, usually with some sort of login button or something. This is going to take us to an identity provider. The identity provider is where the user will log in, and then it'll redirect us back to our application. And once we get back to our application, we're going to have to process that redirect somehow. So we're usually going to work with some sort of Auth SDK that's going to work with us to get the token and the user profile and things like that. And that will happen in like the success. If we get an error, we'll throw an error. And then we'll grab the user and the token, and we will usually have some sort of redirect URL that will send the user to another route, maybe a protected accounts page or something like that. So that's sort of the overview of what the login process looks like. And that really doesn't have anything to do with Gatsby. It actually doesn't even really have anything to do with React. This is just a flow for single page applications. So let's look at using hooks and context for authentication in React and, by extension, Gatsby. So in React, we have the nice thing of being able to use hooks and context to build out this authentication flow in a really compact, reusable way. And the first building block of this, actually the main building block, is going to be this auth utility that we'll create. Inside of this utility, we're going to do things like store the token and the user, we're going to interact with the auth SDK, and we're going to handle all of that redirect logic that I mentioned. So let's get started with this. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a context. So we're going to create an auth context using React create context. And we are going to pass in a default context. This is the first thing that's going to be a little bit different with Gatsby. I'm going to come back to this in a second because I don't want to sidetrack us yet. But we're going to create this context, and we're going to create a hook from this context. So we can use the use context hook, pass in our auth context, and now we have this nice use auth hook that'll allow us to access the values of our context anywhere in the application. So then we need to define our auth provider. And we'll pass in the children and any sort of initialization options that you might need. And then we got to figure out what goes inside of this provider that we're going to export. So let's look inside that. So as we're building out this provider, the first thing we need to do is define a bunch of state. So we're going to have things like, if we have an auth client that our SDK is providing, we'll have to have some state for that and set that. We're going to use some state for things like whether we're authenticated, the token, the user, and then we're going to have a piece of state for some UI state. So if normally when we're logging in, we're going to show or hide things based on whether we're loading, things like that. And then once we have that state set up, we need to do some initialization logic for our auth client. And to do that, we're going to use an effect hook, and we're going to define an asynchronous function. Remember that use effect can't be asynchronous. It has to be synchronous. And so in order to do an asynchronous operation inside of an effect, you need to define an asynchronous function and then call it. So we're going to do that. We're going to initialize an instance of our auth client. So we're going to call our create auth client function that the SDK provides for us, or whatever we need to create that instance, and set that in our hook. Then we need to see whether we're in the middle of a redirect or whether this is sort of a normal booting of the application. So if we're in the middle of a redirect, we're going to have these things in our search bar. And what I'm talking about here is after the user logs in, The identity provider is going to redirect us, but they're going to add stuff in the location bar. And that's going to be the stuff that we'll use. It's going to be a code and a state that we're going to use to exchange for a token. So we need to check and see if that's there. If it is, then we'll proceed to work with the SDK to process all that and then, process the redirect, all of that good stuff. We also need to check whether we're authenticated. This is the same kind of issue. We need to see whether we're already authenticated with the provider, set that piece of state. If we are authenticated, we'll go get the user, set that piece of state, and then we can finally set our loading state to false. So this is our initialization process, and we need to call that function, and we won't have any dependencies in this effect. Cool. So we've defined our state and our effect and all of that. The other thing we'll need to do inside of this provider is probably define some different kinds of callbacks and functions. So we don't need to get too in the weeds with this, but typically you'll do things like define a handle redirect callback function that maybe handles that callback, uses the hooks to set state, things like that. Finally, we'll need to return the provider. So we'll return our provider. We will expose a bunch of things through our value. So we'll expose the stuff that we defined, like the state that we set up and any sort of extra functions that we need. And then we'll also expose some functions from our Auth SDK. So for example, I've got here get token and logout, where we're just kind of passing through any parameters to the SDK's get token method or logout method. So that's our auth utility, which is mostly a provider, some context. So we've seen how our auth utility can store token and the user in memory. It can interact with the Auth SDK, and it can handle all that redirect logic. So if we were to just drop this into a Gatsby application, would it work? Well, the answer is maybe, but probably not. And I want to walk us through why that might be. This is where we need to come back to this concept of build time versus runtime, and we need to think about Gatsby develop versus Gatsby build. So you may have experienced this before, where everything seems to be just fine when you're working in Gatsby develop, but then when you go to run Gatsby build, well, let's just say things don't quite go as planned. You end up getting a bunch of errors in the console, and it's very hard to figure out what's going on. Well, often, the reason that we're having this problem is this idea of build time and runtime, where we've got something going on in the build time that's not working. And so, remember, the build time is where we have this process that needs to generate files for us. And this is why I mentioned we're going to use a default context. Let's take a look at that. What do I mean by that? What's the default context? What's its purpose? So this is the default context that we're going to use. We're going to provide some dummy values or default values for the state, the pieces of state that we're defining, and maybe some of the functions that we're going to use throughout our application. Why do we need to do that? Well, let's take the example of a navbar component. So let's say we have a navbar component, and inside of that, we're using our useAuth hook, and we're pulling out is authenticated and login and logout. And then in our render function, we're going to check to see if we're authenticated. If we're not, we're going to display our login button. If we are authenticated, we're going to display a link to the profile page and a logout button. Cool. So this is kind of straightforward React at this point. But if we think about this with Gatsby, what happens if we use this in a Gatsby page? Let's think that through. Let's say that we're using this index.js page. We've got our navbar here. So we're using the navbar that we just saw in our index page. And when I say page here, I'm talking about the kind of pages that are in the pages folder that Gatsby can kind of magically turn into a route. And so these get run through this build time, this build process. So here in this index page, I'm using the useAuth hook, and I'm checking to see if we're loading. So what happens here is when Gatsby goes to build this, it encounters this index page, and it finds this useAuth hook, and it's looking for those values like loading, but it can't find any, so it's going to break. And this is why we need to provide a default context. We need to make sure that when we're not in the runtime and nothing is actually happening with the user, we still have this fallback for the build process. So then when we provide that default context, Gatsby will find that. It'll find that, loading set to false, and it'll be able to generate the pages that we need in order to run that in the runtime. It's almost like you're mocking, kind of like with testing, like you're kind of mocking out the context values. Not quite, but that's a good way to think about it. So we have a bit of a dilemma here. So we've seen this default context, and we know in a regular React app, we just take our auth provider and just wrap it around our app component. But we can't really do that here, or at least we don't think we can. We don't necessarily have access to the app component in a Gatsby project. There is a way that we can expose it, but it's not really the right answer. So before we get to that, let's instead of doing this once, let's do this with a recipe so that we can replicate this over and over again if we want to. Let's just outline the steps and build a recipe, and that way we can automate it. I love automation. So if you haven't heard of Gatsby Recipes, we'll do a little bit of an overview. I have to say here that we, meaning Auth0, we've been collaborating a lot with the Gatsby folks on this stuff lately. So I want to make sure that I give a proper shout out to people like Kim and Kyle and Obina at Gatsby and my teammates Tyler and James, because this has all been a collaborative effort, and I don't want to take all the credit for myself. So Gatsby Recipes are really cool. They are here to automate your common tasks for you. They're written in MDX, which is Markdown plus React, so you can mix in React components into your Markdown. They're used to install packages and plugins. You can also generate pages and code from them, and then you'll run them from the CLI. And there are some that are pre-built for you that the Gatsby team has built for you, and then you can also build them yourself, which is super exciting. So I said they were written in MDX. So the first thing we're going to do in our Gatsby authentication recipe is we're going to create a local MDX file or a gist. You can do either one. The nice thing about gists is that you can also include JavaScript files and then link to them internally, which is kind of cool. We also said that Gatsby Recipes can install packages and plugins, so we're going to do that. We're going to install whatever Auth SDK that we're using. So to do that in our MDX file, we can include, for our first step, we're going to include the npm package component. And there's some documentation on recipes and how exactly to set this up. You're going to include things like little divider lines in between your steps, and you can include some text around, that you want to show up in the CLI. I'm not going to dig too deep into that just because we've got enough to cover as it is, but we'll use the npm package component, passing the name of the package that we want to install. And then we can also use the recipe to generate pages and code and move things around for us. So let's do that. Let's add the auth provider. We can do that by writing that boilerplate code once in a source folder, and then using this file component to move that into there. So notice here that we have a path option here. That path option is the destination. So we'll create a file called auth.js in the utils folder of the source folder. And then the content option here is like the source. So we'll have let's say we had our recipe files in this auth recipe folder, and we have our auth.js file there. So we're going to just move that over into there. Okay, we're finally going to answer the question where we use the auth provider. We're going to use it in gatsby-browser.js, and this is another area that the recipe can help us with. So Gatsby Browser is a file that lets you tap into kind of the browser side or client side part of the build process. And Gatsby provides a bunch of APIs that you can use, that exposes a bunch of APIs that you can tap into here. So one of them is called wrap root element, and that's exactly what we need to add a context or add a provider to our Gatsby application. So we're going to use wrap root element, and we're going to pass in our auth provider and then wrap our element in that. And this is where you would put in any sort of configuration that you have for your auth provider. So step 3 of our process is to add Gatsby Browser. And again, we can use that file component and pass in a path for Gatsby Browser and the content in our recipe folder. If you were using a gist, by the way, you could also pass in directly the URL of the file in the gist. So it could be either a relative path or an actual URL to the raw MDX of the GitHub gist. Okay, we have another step here, but it may or may not apply to you, but I want to include it because if it does apply to you, this can really trip you up. So remember we talked about build time and runtime, and we talked about how in build time, no browser APIs are available. So you don't have things like window or document, and so you need to watch out for dependencies that might use them. The interesting thing is that a lot of auth libraries do this a lot because auth flows usually involve redirects and pop-ups. So it's not uncommon for an auth library to be relying on things like window or document. Some of them do, some of them don't. And the reason why I say that is in our the Auth0 SDK for single-page applications, we actually just made a tweak that eliminates this step. But I'm aware that a lot of other libraries don't do that, so I want to include it here. To fix this, what you'll need to do is add a Gatsby node file to your application. So in the Gatsby node file, what you can do is you can tap into the Webpack build, and in that Webpack build, you can say, hey, if we're in the build HTML stage or the develop HTML stage, what I want you to do is replace a piece of the config. And what I want you to do is add this rule that says, if I come across the name of my Auth SDK, instead of actually loading the real thing, just skip it. Let's just load a null option here. And that way, if your Auth SDK is relying on things like window or document or things like that, during the build process, those things won't get checked. They won't get called. And so you won't have all those build errors, but they'll still work actually in the runtime of the browser. So step 4, add Gatsby Node.js if that applies to you in your situation. You can again use that file component and move it from the source that you've got into a destination. Great. So lastly is the fun part. You just run this from the CLI after you've got all your steps in your MDX file with your components and your instructions. Then you can just run your recipe, and you'll just do that with the Gatsby CLI. You can say Gatsby Recipes and the path to your MDX file. And again, if you're using a gist, you can just pass the URL of the gist right in here. Be sure that you're passing in the raw link and not the link to the website. Just a minor thing that'll help you out there. Okay, there's another thing that we can do, and we don't have time to really dig too deep into it, but you can actually go one step further in this, and you can change this so that instead of moving things directly into your Gatsby application, you can create a local plugin, an instance of a local plugin. Keep all those files like the Gatsby browser and the auth utility and things like that. You can create that into a local plugin. And this is a really cool way to do this because it makes it really reusable in other projects. I didn't want to start out with this because then it's sort of like adding more things to keep track of in this talk. But this is kind of the next level of this process, because then what you can do is use this Gatsby plugin component in your recipe and create a little plugin. You can call it whatever you want since it's just a local plugin. You could say Gatsby plugin auth recipe, and you can pass in your options for the plugin and then use those options in the provider. So that's a really cool way of doing this. We don't have time to get too far into it, but I do want to point out that my teammate Tyler Clark has actually done this with Auth0, and we have some resources on that. So I'll be sure to link to that as an example, the things that Tyler has done with that in conjunction with Kyle. So that's pretty much it. Let's do a quick review, though, because I know I threw a lot of stuff at you. So we talked about how we love Gatsby. We're all here because we love Gatsby. But that one thing that's interesting is that we sort of come to Gatsby because we think of it as a static site generator, but then we realize that it's actually more of a framework. It's actually a framework built on React. And that leads to some interesting questions like, is authentication in Gatsby, is it just like what we do in React, or are there other things that we can do with it? And so we are thinking through that process, and in order to think that through, we had to look at the build time and the runtime in Gatsby. We talked about how authentication mostly happens in the runtime. And so we looked at our login process, where we start the login process, we get sent over to the provider, we handle the redirect with our SDK that we're using, and then we pull off the user and the token from the response and redirect their user somewhere else. And this is independent of whether you're using Gatsby or React or anything else. And so when we do this in React, we can take advantage of a lot of cool stuff like hooks and context to build out an auth utility that does things like store the token in the user in memory, interact with the Auth SDK, and handle all of our redirect logic. So we talked about creating a context and building out a provider for our auth situation here. We talked about the importance of providing a default context, and that is important because when Gatsby goes to build out these static pages, it needs to make sure that it has values for things like a hook, like a use auth hook. And so that's why we provide that. We also looked at implementing auth using a Gatsby recipe. And this is the really exciting part. This is one of the reasons you could use Gatsby over just vanilla React, is because we could automate this process. And so when we automate this, we can do things like automate common tasks. We'll write these recipes in MDX, and that lets us do things like install packages and plugins and generate pages in code. And then we can do all this straight from the CLI, whether we're using the built-in ones or the custom ones. So we're going to create a custom auth recipe. And to do that, the first thing we do is create an MDX file, either locally or as a gist. And then we will install our SDK. We'll add our auth provider that we built earlier to our project. We'll add a Gatsby browser file so that we can do that wrap root element that we saw. And that way we can pass in any configuration and use our auth provider in our app. You may also need to do this step of Gatsby Node, where you tap into the Webpack type pipeline here in the build time. And this is because, again, there's no browser APIs available for us in that part of the process. And so we need to make sure we're watching out for things like window or document or things like that. So we tap into our Webpack pipeline and check there for the SDK. And then lastly, we just use our Gatsby Recipes command and run our recipe to set this all up in our application. And finally, if we really want to take this to the next level, we can create a local plugin to do this, to reside in our app for us. So that's everything. I hope you're as excited about auth as I am. I know that's like probably unlikely, but I think this stuff is really cool. I think auth is really cool. And of course, I love Gatsby just as much as all of you do. You can find these slides at samj.im/GatsbyDays. I'll also include a bunch of links there, like Tyler's recipe that he built based on Kyle's recipe, and other content that Auth0 and Gatsby has been doing together. We've been working a lot on some very cool stuff together, like streams and articles and open source stuff. So I hope you really enjoy that. And otherwise, do feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at Sam Julien, and I hope you have an amazing rest of the conference, and thank you very much.